Now, in this episode, in Down to Dominance series, we are going to speak about that epic Benson and Hedges series of 95-96. Sri Lanka started winning matches outside Sri Lanka, but Australia is a whole different ball game altogether. It's the most toughest place to tour, especially if you are from a subcontinent and if you are an emerging team with semi-professional cricketers. Because that is one destination which ended the careers of many cricketers and torn so many teams into places and threw them away. So what is the biggest significance of this 95-96 series for Sri Lanka in terms of shaping them as a champions team?
As you correctly said, by the time Sri Lanka went to Australia, they were considered to be a decent contender away from home because they had recorded, as you said, victories in New Zealand and in Pakistan across Test and ODI formats. So therefore the question was whether it was just a one-off instance of Sri Lanka performing well away from home, or did that signify something else? So therefore the answers were to be seen in Australia, and as you correctly said, the context and the conditions in Australia were testing, and there was a lot to look forward for when Sri Lanka went for this Benson and Hedges series. But the most important thing that we need to remember when we interpret the context and the developments of this tournament was the fact that back in the day, the Benson and Hedges series was quite different. The wickets in Australia were quite different. If you looked at the wicket that was in Perth, which was the Wacker, it was fast and bouncy. It was in fact terrorizing in a way, one way or another. And obviously the wickets in Melbourne and Sydney were quite different. And if you go to Hobart, which is in Tasmania, the conditions are quite cold and there's a little bit of tackiness in the wicket. Brisbane is a different type of a wicket altogether. So when you look at this tournament, it was played across all those venues across 4 rounds, which meant that Sri Lanka will be tested to the core. So if there was any chance of Sri Lanka being a strong contender in the 1996 World Cup, which was barely a few months away from this Benson and Hedges series, that would have been surely tested in this series. So there was a lot to look forward to. And most importantly, apart from the context, Australia and West Indies were definitely one of the favorites going into the World Cup, and the format of the tournament was as such that, this was prior to January 31st or the latter part of January, where Australia pulled out, followed by West Indies pulling out their group games in Sri Lanka. So even those group games were going to be critical. So how Sri Lanka would fare in Australia would give them a great deal of confidence. And because of all those factors, there was a lot to look forward to. And most importantly, as I previously said, until the cessation of this triangular series, this was a 4-round tournament, which meant that each team will be playing against each other 4 times, which is an acid test. So if you made it to the final, there was a possibility of 2 teams playing against each other for 7 games, which was absolutely monumental and would be a true test of caliber for any team in those conditions. So considering all those things put together, the Benson and Hedges series was no doubt an acid test for Sri Lanka. But as we would see, it was going to turn out to be much more than an acid test in the months or rather in the weeks that were to follow.
When we speak about this Benson and Hedges series of 95-96, how cannot we miss that epic incident of Murali getting called no ball? It's 1995 Boxing Day test. As you know, it's very much a hostile, intimidating crowd in a Boxing Day test in Australia, and a visiting team from Asia that time who never bothered about us. And then Murali was trying to bowl, and Daryl Hare from the square leg called it no ball. This is 1995 Boxing Day test, but this nasty incident continued in a match against West Indies. Even though Murali was bowling leg breaks, Roy Emerson came back and he called no ball again. Can we live those through moments, and what every Sri Lankan at that time lived through that time?
There's a lot spoken about and written about the Murali incident, and obviously what happened at the MCG on the Boxing Day Test match in 1995 deserves a separate episode in itself. But what transpired in Brisbane, if I'm right, was something probably which would have caught Sri Lanka off guard, because everybody thought in 1995 at that point when Daryl Hare called Murali for throwing that probably it was a one-off incident. But then when Ross Emerson came into the picture, it actually showed that, probably it was a targeted campaign, or probably there was a organized, orchestrated event that was happening. It was a targeted campaign which was orchestrated for whatever reason. And I mean, at the end of the day, when you see Murali ending up with 800 wickets and whatever he became, you could say that was a targeted campaign, or probably they saw something in Murali that the world wasn't seeing at that moment. But it's very hard to understand why that happened. But most importantly, if you remember, if we go through the cricketing literature and many of the publications that have followed in the past, it shows that, there was some sort of an arrangement where the Australian Cricket Board was involved to a degree. Some officials were involved. But all that aside, from a fan's perspective, what it basically meant was that, it was actually putting Sri Lanka's hopes of a successful World Cup campaign in jeopardy. And if you really look at the 1996 campaign, that was the best opportunity we had in a long time. This was a strong core which had been built over time, and Murali was an integral part of that core, despite him not becoming, or rather being, the world beater that he would turn out to be in the years to come. So therefore, when Murali was called not only by Hare, but by Ross Emerson as well, fairly or unfairly, the rule book says that you can call from the square leg, I assume, but still it was quite obvious when he was bowling leg spinners, it's almost impossible to throw the ball, that he was being called, showed that, there was some kind of a conspiracy, or whatever you might like to call, happening, and that was definitely putting Sri Lanka's hopes under the scanner. And what that actually meant from a fan's perspective was that, how would this team react to this? Because this is not something that we have seen in the past. I mean, you have one-off incidents where, there have been criticism about home umpires favoring Sri Lanka. There could have been criticisms about serious factors. There have been a lot of controversies. But your main spinner being targeted with few weeks to go for the World Cup was a major thing. And I think, as Arjuna would recollect in the years that followed, Sri Lanka ran the risk of playing with one player short in the squad if Murali were to be selected in the World Cup squad, and if any other umpire would go on to call Murali. So, that alone, that single thing, that single thought, obviously anybody would have known that, whether Murali would be playing in the World Cup, will he be part of the squad, what will be his psyche, how will he turn up, how will the team handle this, how will the team handle Murali. So all these things were coming into play. So I think more than anything, there are so many facets to the Murali controversy, but the thing that had to be seen was how the team was going to come up against it, and will they succeed in it. And I mean, that actually made up a fairy tale story in Sri Lanka's campaign in the weeks that followed. But at that point in time, I don't think I would be much wrong if I probably say Sri Lanka's hopes were really under the scanner, and probably, it was nearing a hopeless situation when Murali was targeted and these repeated no-ball calls were made.
It's not with Murali, it's not with no ball, but there were few other significant incidents also happened in that series, which actually shaped Sri Lanka's course, or gave Sri Lanka the immense self-belief which they required before going to the World Cup. We should have a look at those tiny, tiny moments, because cricket is won in these kind of tiny, tiny moments, because that gives you immense confidence, and you believe all of a sudden that you can defeat someone, you can hit someone, you can take the wicket of someone. And those beliefs, little blocks built together, gives the mountain which you climb one day and see the view from the pinnacle.
I think this is the favorite part of this conversation for me, because we often talk about the Benson and Hedges series in 95-96 and say, Sri Lanka had a great series and, that's a series to remember for ages. But, there were quite a lot of subplots, the little things that you made, little moments which probably in retrospect makes you think, we should have known that we were destined for greatness when these things happen. And it will be great injustice if I just break it down and go at a helicopter view, give a helicopter view of that. So I'm just going to deep dive into that. And in order to deep dive into that, I'm going to break this the Benson and Hedges series into 3 parts. The part before the Boxing Day Test match, the part which followed in the 1996 New Year, and then the finals. So each of these components, each of these phases has a unique memory and a unique takeaway from a cricketing perspective. So let's dive into the first part, which was the pre-Boxing Day part of this series. And back in the day, if you are new to watching cricket, probably if you didn't watch cricket at that time, it might be quite funny to hear this. Back in the day, the Benson and Hedges series was played in 2 parts, where the Boxing Day Test match and sometimes the New Year Test match, if I remember right, would come in between the series. And this was the case even when Sri Lanka toured Australia in 2002-2003, when the Ashes was happening. The series was, the Sri Lankan team went in during the fag end of 2002 and then came back home and went back in 2003 as well. So, that's how the tournament was structured at that point, and that was given up during the mid part of the 2000s, if I remember right. But there's a critical component to this. So the first part of the series was before the Boxing Day Test match. Sri Lanka played 2 games and they got off to a winning start at Adelaide, beating West Indies quite comfortably. And that meant that, they had their dominance over West Indies from Saga, where they had beaten them in the finals. And this tournament had got off to a winning start, which was quite promising from a Sri Lankan perspective. And then we lost the next game at Melbourne, where we stretched Australia to a great degree, and it took Michael Bevan to score a boundary in the last over with, I think if I remember right, 3 or 4 needed of the last 3 balls, and Bevan hit a boundary and took Australia home in the last over. But from a Sri Lankan perspective, if you go to Melbourne, if you go to Australia and stretch out the Australian team until the last over, having posted something in the region of 250, that was a win in itself. So the first round of this series before Christmas was absolutely brilliant for Sri Lanka. I think from a fans' perspective, the hopes were high. The team had competed, and that's all what you want when you lead into a World Cup, because even if Sri Lanka didn't prevail in this tournament, if they competed, that would be a big boost going into the World Cup. And then obviously we all know what happened during the Test series, during the Boxing Day Test match, the ball tampering saga, the throwing incident, and everything happened, and the tournament began in the New Year. And as the tournament started in the New Year, Sri Lanka played against West Indies. I think their first 2 games were against West Indies, and one was at Hobart and the other one was at Brisbane. And in both the games, Sri Lanka were absolutely thrashed by the West Indies. That was an absolute pummeling, you would call. In one game they defended, I think Sri Lanka did not come close to chasing down their target and lost by somewhere in between 50 to 100. And in another game, West Indies romped home quite easily. And in the second game against West Indies at Brisbane, which was the last game of the first 2 rounds for Sri Lanka, Murali was called. So all of a sudden, from winning the first game in the tournament, at the end of the second round, Sri Lanka had lost 3 games and won only 1 game, which basically meant that the writing was on the wall for Sri Lanka. So it appeared that the Murali saga, the Daryl Hair controversy, had taken its toll on the team, and there was no way that Sri Lanka were going to come up. And this is where magic happened in my words, I would say, because during this period, Sanath was opening the batting, and if you look at the scorecard, you would see in one game, I remember Sanath scored about 20 or 30 runs at a strike rate of around 50. You wouldn't believe that. And this was just a few weeks before the World Cup. And it was at this point, Kalavitarna was having a torrid tournament. In the first 4 games, if I remember right, he did not score much, and he had quite a few ducks as well. And then when Sri Lanka went to Melbourne, beg your pardon, I think the first game I made a mistake, it was in Sydney. And then Sri Lanka went to Melbourne to face Australia. Sri Lanka threw Kalu at the top, and Kalu did what Kalu did, and what Kalu did and how he did that and the implications of that is a story in itself for a different episode. But propelled by Kalu's dominance at the top, Sri Lanka went home or got home against Australia at Melbourne, and I mean it was poetic justice in a way that in the same place where they were humiliated, they came back and prevailed over the Australians. And that was not an easy chase as well. And I think at one point Sri Lanka chasing something in the region of 200 odd, were 150 odd for 6. And Kumar Dharmasena held fort and scored a 28 odd unbeaten 28, which steered Sri Lanka through home. And then Sri Lanka again played Australia at Melbourne, if I remember right. And in that game also Sri Lanka won. And all of a sudden in 2 games Sri Lanka had beaten Australia consecutively, and in between they went to the WACA, Perth, and faced the likes of Bishops, Walsh, Ambrose, and prevailed over the West Indies at Perth. And all of a sudden Sri Lanka had won 3 games and lost 1 game to Australia in Perth, and finished the group stages at 4 wins out of 8 games, and they had got through to the final. And that was an absolutely amazing comeback which showed the mettle and the strength, the resilience and whatever of this team, and especially moments like the bowler standing up against the West Indies at Perth after being bundled out for 202 and defending that score, and then the likes of Dharmasena and Vas seeing Sri Lanka through in tricky nervy chases versus Australia against a vociferous, tough Australian crowd. And these were the moments that made the Sri Lankan team, and these are the little moments that we overlook when we talk about the tournament as a whole. And by the end of the group stages, irrespective of what was to follow in the finals, Sri Lanka had left their signature and made an emphatic statement.
By reliving those moments and walking through that memory lane, I can confidently say something. Sri Lanka might have lost the battle, but they seriously won war. What's this? What's this? Because we are going to speak about how Sri Lanka became the world champions pretty much soon. But as we all know, the seeds were planted in Australia.
As Sri Lanka came into the finals, the key part that we need to remember is that Sri Lanka lost 2-0. The scoreline might say Sri Lanka lost 2-0, but if you really look at the scorecards, the games were much, much closer than what the scoreline would suggest. In one of the finals, Sri Lanka managed to pick up early wickets against Australia, and they had them for something like 4 down for less than 50 and a half century by their wicketkeeper batter Ian Healy, obviously a famous character in the sledges between Arjuna and Healy. A famous character in those duels, played a knock which actually took the game away from Sri Lanka. And then in the second final, which was a rain truncated chase, Sri Lanka fell short by less than 20 runs. So, and mind you, in those 2 games, it's very critical to mention that there were a lot of decisions that went against Sri Lanka, especially one of those decisions against Ramesh Kalvitarne in one of those games where he tried to play across the delivery from Magra, and probably there was an inside edge or something. And, the decisions didn't go Sri Lanka's way, and there was a lot of controversy. There was a lot going around, but despite of all that, Sri Lanka stretched Australia and still lost by 2-0. But whatever that we had to remember was the fact that in one of those games we bundled out Australia for less than 220, and we were in with a good chance. I think that was the first final, and those were the moments which would have given Sri Lanka a lot of confidence. And mind you, having Australia 4 down for less than 50 in a big game like a final, despite of the end outcome, would have been a massive confidence boost for the fast bowlers who were part of this team, because you would see Chaminda Das, Ravindra Pushpakumara, Pramodya Wickramasinghe. So these were the players who were going to go and play for Sri Lanka in the World Cup. So these little moments mattered, and there was one important moment I would like to take your attention to, or probably recollect, was in one of those finals, probably the second final if I remember right. Mark Waugh actually played a flick and it went to square leg and the catch was dropped. So I think it must have been Vas who was bowling over the wicket, and the characteristic Mark Waugh flick, ball went to square leg, the catch was dropped. But if you recollect the 1996 World Cup final, you would remember that that was the exact way in which Mark Waugh was dismissed, and Mark Waugh was the most important batter for Australia at that point in time. He went on to top the charts for Australia in the 1996 World Cup. He was in princely form, scored 100 in the quarterfinals versus New Zealand, helping Australia get to the semi-finals. And, probably when you connect those two, you might think that, those were the moments, and probably despite that drop catch, Sri Lanka would have felt confident that Mark Waugh was vulnerable for that shot, and that might have played a critical part in the final as well, which we never have heard anywhere or seen written anywhere. But those are the little moments which mattered. So overall, if you see throughout the final, the second stage of the Benson and Hedges series, and the part before the Christmas, there were many moments which actually should have suggested that Sri Lanka were a serious force to contend with. But for me, what would actually stand out was the fact that how Sri Lanka came back from all the unreasonable things that they had to face, how they stood up as a team and sailed through that and stretched Australia to the core in their backyard is what mattered to me the most. And by the end of the series, you would have known that Sri Lanka were a special side, and they were going to be hard opponents to overcome in subcontinent conditions, especially in home conditions. And if anybody predicted that, I'm pretty sure they would have been proud, because we all know what followed in the next few weeks.